Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the August 20th edition of ICLR's Friday Milk Forum. My name is Mark Elliott, and today we have a two-part presentation for you. The first part, titled The National Guide for Wildland Urban Interface Fires, will be presented by Dr. Noureddine Bénichou, and the second portion, an impact analysis of the WUI guide, is being presented by Dr. Keith Porter. As the Principal Research Officer within the National Research Council of Canada's Fire Safety Group, Dr. Bénichou conducts research on subjects such as the modeling and experimentation of fire resistance in structures, fire safety in buildings, fire risk analysis, and impact of wildfires on the wildland urban interface. Dr. Porter co-leads SPA Risk, an applied research firm specializing in multi-hazard disaster risk to buildings and lifelines. He also holds an adjunct professorship at the University of Boulder, Colorado. He led the Natural Hazard Mitigation Save Studies for the U.S. National Institute of Building Sciences, the most extensive and widely cited benefit-cost analysis of natural hazard mitigation ever. He led the engineering for the U.S. Geological Survey's revolutionary shakeout, arc storm, tsunami, and haywire disaster scenarios. He also helped to pioneer second-generation performance-based earthquake engineering methods encoded in FEMA P58. Now, before I hand things off, there are a few notes to be aware of for today's session. You can submit your questions at any time during the presentation to the designated Q&A chat box on the Zoom interface. These will be answered in a dedicated question and answer session immediately following the presentation. If you experience any technical issues during the presentation that you would like us to be aware of, please use the general chat feature for that. I would also like to take a moment to advertise next month's Friday Forum, which will occur on Friday, September 21st, and be on the subject of coastal flooding. With that bit of housekeeping out of the way, I'll now hand things off to Dr. Bénichou. Take it away, Noureddine.
All right. Thanks, Mark, for the introduction. Good day, everyone. So, first of all, our prayers are with those who are impacted by the wildfire these days, and hopefully things will ease up soon. So today I'm going to be presenting the National Guide for Wildland Urban Interface that was developed by the National Research Council in collaboration with a number of stakeholders. And just briefly, the National Research Council is an agency reported to the Parliament. We do work on science and technology, and we disseminate this information mostly free of charge. People can download the work that we do and then can use it. As far as the work that we did on wildfire, it was part of a large project on climate change. The government of Canada invested $42.5 million through Infrastructure of Canada, and the work was to deal with climate change and in particular extreme events such as wildfires. And the work, Infrastructure of Canada, custodian of the budget, hired the National Research Council in 2016 to do a 4-year project and to develop tools that are going to be used for mitigating climate change and extreme events. And the work has concluded at on March 31st of this year, and another phase is starting soon. The purpose of the work, it was under a project called Climate Resilient Building and Core Public Infrastructure, and that was to develop solutions and tools in terms of codes or changing codes, guides, models for mitigating the impact or reducing the impact of climate change and extreme event on existing and new buildings as well as core public infrastructure. And that work was in terms of gathering climate data and then incorporate that data in codes and standard. And National Building Code was a recipient of some of it, dealing with how buildings are affected by extreme event. Same thing for bridges, roads, water and wastewater. And in terms of outcome, it's mostly decision support tool that can be used by designers and those practitioners. So this work on wildfire was part of it, and I started in 2016. We started initially by doing a gap analysis on WUI fires in particular, And those wildfires, we know that they affect residents and infrastructure in WUI areas. We identified what's the current practices, what kind of roadmap have been developed, what are the approaches. We identified gaps in some of the work, and we established basically what kind of research NRC should be doing in the identified gaps. And so there was a roadmap that was developed to minimize, in particular, obviously for this case, impact of wildfires or WUI fires. So this is a flow chart of what kind of work we started in 2016. So wildfires can be wildfires in the forest, or wildland fires, or could be WUI fires which are spreading to community and damaging communities. So the work was under the large project, but was dedicated or addressed, tried to address impact on buildings. This work is mostly done by NRCan, so this is something that we did not want to get into, forest fires in the forest. But we targeted the WUI fires, and then we identified a number of areas. One of them is WUI fires mapping test methods, if they don't exist, or they exist in some countries, but in Canada we don't have a lot of test method dealing with WUI fires. WUI fire modeling, something that we wanted to check because testing can be costly, and then what kind of modeling can we do due to radiation, amber, and so on. We also did a little bit of work on the data that can be gathered post WUI fires. We have been doing work on WUI fire evacuation, but not part of this project, mostly part of other projects. And then the one that I'm going to be talking about is the National Guide for WUI fire, which was a large piece of this work. So initially, when we started this work, we identified there is really no national guide or code for WUI fires in Canada. They exist somewhere else. We have, let's say, Fire Smart, which are some guidelines that have been addressing some of the issue, but we wanted to cover a little bit more than that. We wanted to expand on the scope of what a guide document would do for Canada. And so the objectives were to envision and define what are the needs for Canada initially for having a national guide or a national code. At the time, we didn't know with which way we wanted to go. And then ultimately, we decided it was better suited at this time to develop a guide so that it can be tried and so on before we moved maybe to standardized documents. And this guide was the objective to develop it in partnership with stakeholders. So how we did it and who was involved. So initially we struck an international technical committee, was made of 22 members. And obviously NRC, I led the work with our team. And then underneath the technical committee, we put together 4 task groups. And then we worked with them to develop the content with the different chapters of the guide. The collaborators were made, or the stakeholders were made from governments, academia, industry, consultancy, and standard body. We wanted to make sure that all the stakeholders are represented. Obviously, this is a large group, and we couldn't accommodate much more than that because I think it's difficult to manage 22 people already. And then our process was to develop the content and then do regular meetings. Before COVID, we were doing face-to-face meeting for the TC technical committee. And then the TGs were meeting basically on virtually after the COVID issues, when we start meeting virtually only, and then until we produced the final guide, which was published this past June. This is the membership of the stakeholders. So the variety of all those who are involved nationally and internationally, and then this is our team. I led the work, but obviously a lot of effort from everyone involved in here and the technical committee. So technical committee, this is the group that drove the work, but the task group had also members that were not part of the technical committee, but they were extra. So in total, I think we had probably 40 people with the technical committee, and then plus the NRCT. So at the start, we wanted to identify, okay, what are the core elements for the guide? Well, what would be the basis for it? So, and then it became clear that based on what we have reviewed in the gap analysis and then the discussion with the technical committee and others, there are 4 core elements, 3 in a way. The hazard and exposure. So we need to know where the impact or which community are going to be impacted and which properties are going to be impacted. So that would be through some hazard and exposure evaluation. And then we have the properties, which are the structures that are going to be part of the community. And then we have the community at large. So the hazard and exposure will feed into or provide the location where issues have to be addressed, and then part of the property is to see how we mitigate structures, and then how we also design and put in place measures for the community to reduce the impact of these wildfires or WUI fires. So this is the content of the guide. There are 5 chapters in here, an introduction, and I'll go briefly through some of these. Hazard and exposure, a structure ignition zone. This is terminology that is used in Canada. I think in the US they use probably defensible space. And then we have the community planning and resources and the planning and emergency planning and outreach. So just quickly, I wanted to click here. I think hopefully people have received the guide, or there are links to the guide. So this is just a publicly available version in English. We have it in French as well. So if we go through just the table of content, it's about a 200-page document with the initial part of it. Then we have the introduction that talks about wildfire in Canada and how to use the guide. We have the section on hazard and exposure. So there is some background, and we have some methodologies that I will talk about in a minute. Then we have the structure ignition zone. This is where what kind of zone or at least the material or the measures that should be put together so that we minimize the impact. So there is this is where I think this chapter initially we wanted to put it in a code language, but ultimately we had to revise it to make it more in a guidance document, with the hope that in the future it could move to a standard or code language chapter. And then we have the 2 community chapters that are dealing with all kinds of life safety issues. And then we have a number of appendices that are useful for the user to when you need more information about some items in the core chapters. So now let me just go into a little bit of some brief but some details about what's the content. So the introduction, so wildfire in Canada, that's general. About this guide itself, how is it used? Who are the users? Basically, there's a section on who are the users. And then every user has a different stake into this. So the government, a local government, these are typically the authority, the development team that is building it, it's a structure or community. They have another way of looking at this. Then insurance company, for example, will have another. So we basically gave in this section how every user can use the document and what kind of information are going to be useful for them. One section that is important in this introduction is how to use the guide. And this is a flow chart that briefly I'm going to explain it. And then when we go to the different chapter, it's going to be more details in there. So if you want to use this guide, then the first thing is to determine where the community is. The community to be evaluated has to be, we need to locate it. If this community has fuel within, or the structure in this community have fuel of a certain type, F1, F2, F3, and then we'll talk about those in a minute, within the 500 meter, then we have to do some evaluation. If there is nothing, then we don't need to do anything and the assessment stop here. So, but in the case of fuel existing within 500 meter, then we locate the community on a map, and then we determine what's the hazard level for that community. So if the hazard level, and then we'll evaluate, I'll show you how we do the evaluation of the hazard level. If it's above a 1, which is nil or very low, then we go and then do property protection evaluation and life safety protection, life safety evaluation. If it's not, then we stop again and there is nothing to be done. So if we go now to the next one and show that for the 2 branches for property protection and life safety, there are also evaluation to be done. So if we take the life safety, we typically take the community and do a vulnerability assessment. The vulnerability assessment, we have an appendix C for life safety vulnerability assessment in the document. And then, so there are these are basic question of a yes or a no. So if it's a yes or a no, you can determine whether the community is vulnerable. If that's the case, if it's vulnerable, then we have to go to chapter 4 and 5 with the measure in there, and then we start applying them. And then we evaluate again whether we have met the vulnerability assessment. So once we have done that a few times, and then we have a VA that is a pass, then if it's a yes, then we go and then we finish the process. If from the beginning the VA is a pass, then we don't do anything, and the community is resilient from a point of view of the measures that are existing in this guide. On the property side, so when we have the hazard level over 1, then we determine what's the exposure level. So we have a methodology for determining the exposure level. If the exposure level is less than, not higher than nil, then we don't do anything. If it is, then we go and then determine, is this a new community or is it an existing? If it's a new community, then we take the provisions of chapter 3 and adopt them, and that will be basically meeting the vulnerability assessment for property, and that will be after that the end. If it's an existing community, then we evaluate whether structures in this existing community are vulnerable or not. And vulnerability is to go to the provision or the measure of the chapter and then see whether we have those measures meeting the requirement of that chapter. And then if they do meet, then that's it. We don't have to do anything. We stop the process. If not, then we can evaluate what's missing and then adopt some of it or all of it. I mean, this is left to the authority to decide that. So this is the overall, and then we put basically a repeat of this process every 5 years. We were trying to link it to the National Building Code, which is a 5-year, it's updated on a 5-year basis, or when you have a major development in a community, and then in that case, you have to repeat the process here. So this is how to use it. Now, in order to understand whether we need hazards or we need to do assessment, the first thing is to evaluate whether we have fuel of this type F1, F2, F3 within the 500 meter of structure. And these are the fuel types that are defined here. We have F0 all the way to F3. So if you have these within 500, then an assessment is needed. If you don't have any of these within the 500, there's nothing to be done, and then we stop that process. So if an assessment is to be done, then we go to this map. This map was developing in collaboration with NRCan, so they use their own modeling, and then we put together levels of the hazards through this map. So it goes from 1 all the way to 4, and then you can pick any location here, and then you can identify which level you are at. So the red is in the high. So if you are somewhere in BC or Alberta and so on, and Ontario as well in Quebec, then you may be facing a high or moderate, and some areas they don't have any real danger here. Now we put this map in the guide, but it doesn't mean that's the only map that can be used. Local maps or hazard map that are developed by local authorities or local communities, they can use their own map and they can identify what's the hazard level that they have to deal with. Now, after that, once we have determined the hazard level, then we go for an exposure assessment. We have 2 methods for the exposure assessment. One is simplified, and that is based on some of the work that Jen Beverly has done. And I believe that FireSmart may be using something similar. So here it's, once we know what's the hazard level, then we can evaluate what's the exposure. The exposure is based on this table. So you determine the fuel type within the 100 meter. And then if it's F0 all the way to F1. And then also, once you have determined that, then you go to between 100 all the way to 500, and you determine what's the fuel type there. Based on these 2 here, you can go horizontally and you decide what kind of exposure you have. So if you have, let's say, F0, and then you within 100 to 500 also in F0, then exposure level in nil, and you don't have to do anything. But even if you have within 100 F0, but you have F1 to F3 within the 100 to 500, then you may have amber only, and in that case you have certain exposure, and the same thing for the others actually. So this is how we determine. We simplified it based on a method that exists, and then we can determine what's the exposure level. These exposure level, then eventually they will make it to chapter 3 to decide the measures. Now, if you go to the detailed method, the assessment is done not only for 500, but we go all the way to 2,000 meters, 2 kilometers. And these are basically the priority zones. We have 1A, 1, 2, 3. These are priority zones. Zone 4 and 5, we call them exposure zones. So the exposure is through embers, radiant heat, or direct flame. And then we evaluate all these 5 zones. So the first step is to go with zone 1A and 2. So this is from 0 to 30 meters, and we assess in accordance to this table. So if you are from in these zones here, then you evaluate what kind of surface fuel you've got, and then based on that surface fuel, you can determine what's your exposure. And then you take the highest in here, be it 0 to 3 or 3 to 30 meters. So it could be high, it could be nil, obviously, in this case. So, but that's depend on the fuel. So that's from zone 1 and 2. Then after that, you go to zone 3, and then the exposure zones 4 and 5, and you determine what type of fuel you've got in there. And then again, it's the same fuel type that we have I have shown before, but we are evaluating it for 30 meters all the way to 2,000 meters. So based on that fuel, so from the 30, which is zone 3, to 100, you have this type, same thing for 4 and 5. But now we also have what kind of density or the percentage cover. Is it less than 10%? Is it 50%? That will determine the exposure. And then also, do you have a slope? If you have a slope, then that can be, depending on the, if it's higher than 20, that can make the exposure from a low, for example, to moderate if you have that 20% at 10% cover. And then we do the same thing. So for each zone, evaluate what kind of exposure, and then we take the overall exposure is the highest exposure between zone all the way for 1A all the way to zone 5. And then that will be the highest level. And this is basically a flow chart to show you how we did that, because I've gone through it in the tables. So this is just a flow chart that makes it easy to follow. And then once we have the exposure and we have the hazard level, we combine them to get the exposure level. And that exposure level can range from nil all the way to high, depending on the combination from the exposure and hazard level. And these values from the detailed method are going to be used by Chapter 3 for the construction measures. Now, if I go to the Chapter 3, which is the structure ignition zone, this is where once we have determined the exposure level, we can go and start addressing the construction measure and priority zones here. So the first thing is that the general applicability here is that we apply these to new and existing buildings. So you can do it both ways. And we have levels. We combined amber and low into one level. And then we have the moderate and high. These are the exposure level coming from Chapter 2. Then we have determined what we called construction classes. These construction classes are based on how good we have mitigated or we have managed our priority zone. Priority zone are 1A, 1, 2, and 3, all the way to 100 meters. The better we manage this, the less measures we need in terms of construction requirement. So if you don't manage your property zones at all, which means that you have trees basically adjacent to the property, so they're almost there within the one, so you're not managing any of the priority zone, then we have indicated that you need construction class that is 1 and with a fire rating. So your outside walls have to be fire rated, and that fire rating can be 1 hour. The more you manage your zones, the better, the less measure you need. So if you manage 1A, which means like you have and management of this is another section in this chapter, then you're reducing your fire rated to a CC1. So a CC1 means it's a non-combustible typically, but you don't have to be fire rated. But within the moderate or high, you still need a fire rating, but that fire rating is reduced now from 1 hour to 45 minutes. And then the more you manage, the better it is. So if you manage all zones from 1A all the way to 3, then you need construction class 3, which is the least strict in terms of measures. So if I just give you an example here, for exterior walls, first of all, any existing regulation should not be contradicted. So if the code dictate or standard dictates something already, then we cannot use the guide to contradict that. So it has to be in line. So if I take the exterior walls, first we can select the requirement from this or the measures from this table here. So for a construction class CC1FR or CC1, this is typically non-combustible. That's how we addressed it. CC2 is ignition resistant, and CC3 is limited ignition, means you can use fire-rated wood, for example. So for buildings in construction class CC1FR, if you don't have any mitigation of the priority zone, you need a 1 hour fire-rated wall, exterior wall. If 1A is mitigated, or at least managed, then you need only 45 minutes in this case. So, but if you go to a construction class of 2 or 3, then you can have exterior wall that can be made of log wall construction. So we give the option, so the better you manage, the less measure you need, and then in that case, the less requirement on your construction. And then we do the same thing for all kinds of construction measures, from foundation walls to elevated buildings, to roofing, to doors and windows, balconies. And then we have section on liquefied petroleum gas tanks as well. And then we also have 2 sections on fire department access routes as well as access route design, so which are important sometimes for life safety here. Then after that, we have a section on priority zone. FireSmart has something similar to here, but I would just basically describe how you can manage your priority zone. So, and then that's going all the way from 1A all the way to 3. Keith, I think, will present like managing these zones can be very effective in terms of mitigating against wildfire, and then gives you the best benefit, cost benefit, and I think he will talk about that. So it's important to manage the zone to reduce the recommended measures, as I was mentioning, but it sometimes may be difficult, because if you go all the way to 100, zone 3, and then you have a number of properties, maybe it's difficult for everyone to buy into that process. We also have part of the priority zones if you adjust for slopes, if you want to accommodate setbacks, and then also fire breaks and fuel breaks. Some of this information coming from both the ICC as well as the FireSmart and FireWise. So there's some information that is in line with what exists already. Then after chapter 3, so these are the measures of chapter 3 structures. Then we go to community. Community is related mostly to life safety, although there are some provisions for property protection. So for us in the guide, we have stated that if a community is exposed to hazard level greater than 1, then the provision should be applied. So, and then how we do apply those, we have a level of application. I think we have 2 sections in the community planning and resources. One of it is planning the WUI. So how we plan the WUI, how to construct that. So we have a number of items. So demographic is an important feature. You would like to know, for example, the age of the population, because that can tell you what kind of need, for example, to evacuate them if they are elderly in that. If they are able-bodied people, then maybe the strategy changes. So evacuation obviously depends on the age of the population, the special need people, disabilities, and so on. They need to be considered. So that demographic is so important that you need to evaluate the characteristic of the communities. Land use and development is another point in the planning of the WUI. So if it's a new development, then you try to minimize the hazard by making sure that the provisions or the structure are spaced and mitigated in terms of priority zones and so on. So if there is an intensification in the area, then you want to also make sure that your exposure level is reduced as much as possible. You would like to consider water supply, so there is some provision or measures for the plan for water supply. Access routes, important. So you need to know the number of access routes, because that would be determining how safe how people can move through those, or access for the fire department. That's an important one. Egress routes, how you are trying to move people. You have to plan for that within the community. Are people going to be walking? But if they have special need, you need to put provision to ensure that they have access to transportation at a very short distance. How many egress routes? Because people can stuck if they have only one way out, and that way out is blocked by fire or smoke. And then the community should be aware of these are the egress routes that are existing. So there has to be some communication to the community to know what the risk and how to get out of it. Just like in a building, usually you have a plan. Same thing for wildfire, you need to have a plan for communicating with the community. Areas of refuge, if there is a need where I think the evacuation is going to be difficult, and then access to people to lift them from that, then you have to accommodate for some areas of refuge so that people can wait there until the rescue operation is carried out. And there could be community facilities that are built in such a way that can be dedicated to the refuge areas. Resources is also a big item in the guide in chapter 4. So you have to know what kind of power supply are there in the air, are there underground, what kind of structure that is supporting these grid, because depending on where you are, if it's combustible, is it appropriate? Does it have to be non-combustible? So we put some information about the decision to make to provide for power supply. Water supply, same thing. Transportation during emergency. Are people going to use buses or other means? Because again, that is important, because the time sometimes is so fast that if you don't have the plan in place and people are aware of it, maybe it's going to be difficult for them to move out. Firefighting capabilities, and then also whether the firefighter should be authorized to intervene and enter access residences in case they need to do that, but there has to be some legally provided to them as well. And then the last chapter is emergency planning and outreach. So again, this is whenever you have a hazard level that is over 1, then the provision of this chapter should be implemented. This is mostly life safety, but it can be also property protection. That's some of it is in terms of property protection. So in this chapter, we address the emergency planning of the community. So how do you plan for WUI evacuation? So before anything happens, you have to have a plan. So and in that case, what kind of resources you need? Do you need additional resources? Who's the authority that triggered that evacuation? So identify the people who are in that role. During the emergency, you have to evaluate the weather conditions and so on. So and then what kind of forecast is out there so that when you evacuate them, they will not be trapped by fire or smoke. So those are definitely during the wildfire. And then in general, the evacuation planning, do you have to shelter in place? In some situation, I think it's not, in general, it shouldn't be, we shouldn't shelter in place, but in some cases, I think it's going to be very difficult for the evacuation to take place. And in that case, the risk of injury from wildfire may be accommodated to shelter in place for a little bit of time until the rescue is there. The plan for emergency planning is an important one also. The channel of communication. I think every community should design or at least allow for what kind of channel of communication. That depends on a number of factors. Do they have internet around? Do they have cell phones that can have social media that people can interact, or people need to be to have communication door to doors, because sometimes that's the only way. So you have to adapt basically based on the characteristic of the community, and then the content of the message has to also be short, from a trusted source, and so on. So these are things that have to be planned for. And then the education is an important aspect also. So I think educating the community and the resident for the risk that for wildfire and how to deal with them is a very important, because you prepare them for if something happens and they have to be. And then the communication plan has some elements. I think some communities have already some of this, but if not, then they can use some of the element in the guide. So this is overall view of the guide. I just some thoughts on some development, the process. We had the process in place to make the development more supported by stakeholders. We had a wide range of stakeholders. And then we have a first guide here, a national guide for Canada. The challenge is obviously difficult to satisfy all the requirements for stakeholders. So we have to there has to be some compromise and so on. We also have to deal with how the measures that are here interact with the existing codes. And I think this is something that we're going to be doing in the next phase, where we want to minimize the conflict. For example, if you have a wall that is fire rated, how is going to be impacted by how these requirements impact, let's say, energy efficiency. So the conflict have to be evaluated. And then the duration of the development, it took us 2.5 years to about 3 years. So it's a long process, but it's important to do it right with the time that we have in hand. Future work is, we were trying to move this guide to standard or standardized document. This is the next phase that we're going to do. I don't have all the details. I put a plan in place, but I'm going to be working on that and have some thoughts at a later stage. During the process of developing the guide, it became clear that we need something for indigenous and northern community because they have specific need. So this is something that we're also looking at and maybe working with indigenous and northern community. And the impact of wildfire smoke. This is an important aspect because we have seen this, and I think we have to have some, we're working on some research project that may be useful for community to use. With that, thank you very much, and I'll be waiting for some of the questions. Mark?
Well, thank you, Dr. Bénichou. That was very informative. And I can see there's already a bunch of questions filling up the Q&A chat box right now, but we will save all those for a combined question answer period at the end of the presentation. So with that, I will pass things on to Dr. Keith Porter for his section of the presentation. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much. Okay, so I'm a structural engineer and natural disaster researcher, and I'm going to talk about the benefit cost analysis of the National WUI Guide, which we also call an impact analysis. Dr. Bénichou has already explained the motivation behind writing the National WUI Guide, the steadily increasing WUI catastrophes. I just want to point out that these catastrophes don't just affect the people in the WUI, they affect pretty much everyone throughout Canada because the losses trickle out into the broader economy through public response and recovery costs, through trade, and so on. So everybody pays for WUI fires, and therefore everybody benefits from the National WUI Guide, not just the people who live in the WUI. So the WUI Guide will help us in Canada to build better, to better resist those fires. So the impact analysis set out to answer the question, what are the costs and the benefits of the National WUI Guide? Basically, what's the business case to follow the guide? These are the, I beg your pardon, could you skip back 2 slides for me? Thanks very much. The 13 people contributed to this impact analysis. The authors up at the top include disaster risk engineers. We also had advice and expertise offered by builders and insurance experts and finance people and so on. I'm going to speak briefly about the objectives of the impact analysis, then I'll very briefly summarize our methods. I will summarize some findings and conclusions. That's an excellent question, Christine. Then I'll talk about some possibilities for future implementation. The objectives for the benefit cost analysis were to provide estimates of the benefits and the costs of complying with the WUI Guide, both for the homeowner and the community. We sought to select a statistically representative sample of existing buildings to represent buildings that would have to be retrofitted to comply with the recommendations of the guide, and a subset of those newer construction to represent new buildings as one would comply with the recommendations for new construction. As we scaled up from the homeowner to the community to the national level, we added in the community costs, and we sought to characterize the benefits by each of 9 benefit categories. The products that came out of the impact analysis are this 5-page overview document shown on the left and a 136-page scholarly report shown on the right. Don't worry about the URLs. I'll show them at the end of my deck, or repeat them at the end of my deck, so that you can follow up both with them if you care to. I want to briefly summarize our methods. We sampled 9 communities and 11 to 12 houses in each community for a total of 102 houses. We sampled the communities from east to west, from low to high hazard, from small to large communities. And from that sample, we picked a couple of older and a couple of newer cases to represent typical construction. We used new CAL FIRE ignition and loss data to create our models of the probability of ignition and the loss given that a house catches fire. We then estimated the costs and the benefits on a very detailed level. We examined the costs and the benefits for each of 15 options per house. Dr. Bénichou showed you 3 exposure levels and 5 options for vegetation management. We estimated costs for each one, and we added in costs associated with climate change and demand surge. Demand surge is a thing where costs temporarily rise after large natural disasters. Here are the communities that we sampled. The stars are the communities. The red stars are communities in high hazard, yellow in moderate hazard, green in low hazard. And you're seeing a sample from Zillow. That's the kind of data that we collected on each of 11 to 12 houses for each of these stars, for a total of 102 houses. Here's the house that we selected that represents something like the median existing house in the moderate to high hazard area. It's a 3-bedroom, 2.5-bath house, 1 story, 1 basement, built in the 1970s. A total replacement cost new of $486,000. It would cost $30,300 to retrofit to comply with the recommendations of the WUI guide. We estimated the costs for all of our sample houses and all of those 15 options. The upper table is showing you the 15 options for new construction, the lower table, the 15 options for existing construction, and the numbers in the table are the square foot costs. So the upper table is showing that a new house can comply with the recommendations of the WUI guide for $5 to $7 per square foot, almost entirely by fire-resistant cladding, by non-combustible cladding and fire-resistant cladding. The lower table shows that you can achieve basically the same square foot cost purely for retrofitting a house purely through vegetation management. Now, retrofitting is always more cost-effective, it costs more costly than building new. So to retrofit a house with non-combustible cladding and fire-resistant cladding costs about 2 or 3 times more than for new construction, but it can still be very cost-effective, as I'll show you momentarily. But of course, vegetation management is complicated. Vegetation management can require the cooperation of 3 neighbors if you are just controlling vegetation within priority zone 1, or 7 neighbors if you're controlling vegetation out to priority zone 2, or 25 neighbors out to priority zone 3. And all of that coordination has to be done over the life of the building. So it's hard enough to get 3, 7, or 25 neighbors to cooperate for 10 years, let alone 7 years. It would be 75 years, the life of a property. So it would be very challenging. This is information, this is research by Gower et al. That we use to estimate hazard, that is to say, the frequency with which fires strike any particular area. And these 15 regions represent tree species and weather and so on, attributes that Dr. Bénichou already spoke about. This table, this figure, shows some information that we acquired from CAL FIRE, and it characterizes how each of many building attributes affected the probability of ignition in the 2018 Camp Fire in California. The box on the left shows how different deck or elevated porch construction affects the probability that a house would ignite relative to the average case. So that red dot there shows that if you have a wood elevated deck, a house with that characteristic would be 2.5 times more likely to ignite in a WUI fire than the average case. You can also see other attributes that appear in the National WUI Guide, such as the construction of the eaves, the exterior siding, the roof construction, and so on. So this is a big step forward in modeling the ignition probability for houses in the WUI. So let me give you some findings and conclusions of the impact analysis. At the national level, if every community that was in the WUI adopted the National WUI Guide and enforced it completely, the country would enjoy a benefit cost ratio of 4 to 1. That is to say, $4 saved per dollar of additional construction cost. Now that's a national average. In the high hazard areas, that benefit cost ratio at the community level is 14 to 1, and that includes all those community costs to which Dr. Bénichou alluded, like vegetation management around electrical lines and emergency firefighting, water supply, and so on. These two charts show where those benefits come from. The chart on the left shows how the benefits break out for a retrofitted house. The chart on the right, where the benefits come from for new design. Both charts are pretty much identical. They show that about half of the savings, that is to say the avoided future losses, come from reduction in building and content loss. About 25% comes from reduction in insurance, overhead, and profit, about 20% from reduced future deaths and injuries, and small fractions from other contributions to benefits. Okay, so let me give you some top 10 list of lessons learned here. New houses built to satisfy the National WUI Guide save over 30 to 1. As a matter of fact, 34 to 1. Now, earlier I said 14 to 1, but that included community costs. The homeowner has only a fraction of those costs, so the cost in the denominator is lower, so the benefit cost ratio is higher. Homeowners in high hazard areas have a benefit cost ratio of 34 to 1. But even retrofitting can be quite cost effective with a benefit cost ratio to the homeowner of 14 to 1. Communities, when you add in the community costs, save up to $14 per additional cost of construction. That includes the cost of utilities and other community costs. And at the national level, the country would save 4 to 1. That's $500 billion in avoided future losses at a cost of about $125 billion. At the national level, the WUI Guide would create 20,000 long-term jobs, save 2,300 lives, avoid 17,000 non-fatal injuries in cases of post-traumatic stress disorder, and increase tax revenues by $1 billion. And of course, the nature-based solutions, where we rely more on vegetation management, save even more, with benefit cost ratios as high as 100 to 1. Now, in order to achieve those very, very high benefit cost ratios, we would have to have stakeholders working together to follow the National Guide. Thanks, Christine. Yes, to follow the National Guide to lower those costs, but it would take cooperation. Climate change is an important factor here. It increases the future losses by 40%, and therefore it increases the benefits of complying with the guide by 40% as temperatures rise, humidity falls, and fire season lengthens. And of course, municipalities and utilities share the cost burden. They actually share slightly over the majority of the costs for compliance. Now, the benefit estimates that I've showed you here are conservatively low. Wherever there was a great deal of uncertainty about benefits, we estimated on the low side. And there are a number of benefit categories that we couldn't quantify, such as historical and cultural value, peace of mind, pets, and so on. And of course, no study is complete. There's always more to do. To reduce fire loss, the National Research Council can address the science of better address the science of climate change, engineering details, and a number of social issues. We suggest 12 such topics, and I'm going to touch on one or two of them before we conclude for Q&A. So let me give you the first couple of implementation ideas, then I'll skip to the end so you can see the URL for the full list. First of all, we think that it would help the homeowners and communities to decide whether to follow the recommendations if individual homeowners could see the costs and the benefits to them individually, considering the particular location of their houses. So we estimated costs and benefits for sort of archetypical buildings in sort of archetypical locations, but the same techniques that we used could be built into like a web app that could give you benefit cost ratios, or at least an approximation of the benefit cost ratios for your house, considering those 15 options that you face. Second, there's a lot of people who benefit from complying with the WUI guide, not just the homeowner, but the tenant, the lender, the insurer, the local state and the local, provincial, and federal government. All those people enjoy co-benefits, so it seems fair to have them help pay for the cost of construction. If we share back some of those construction costs back from the co-beneficiaries to the developer or to the owner, we make it more likely that people will engage in voluntary compliance, and more likely that the community as a whole will benefit. So that we have imagined a number of legal and contractual arrangements that could fairly share back some of those co-benefits to the owner or the developer to help them offset the costs of construction. I'm going to just name the other 8 ideas we have here for implementing the National WUI Guide without going into detail. We suggested a guide to coordinating vegetation management. We suggested documentation of nature-based practices that Indigenous populations have been pursuing for probably centuries. We suggest addressing impacts on renters and other disadvantaged groups who are sort of left out of the impact analysis that we examined here. We suggest reconciling the fire vulnerability models. The one I showed you was for what drew on information from the campfire, but there's different data that was drawn out of the Fort McMurray wildfire. Dr. Bénichou has already spoken about reconciling the National WUI Guide with the National Building Code and other codes. That would have to happen. We would want to, it would be worthwhile to understand the public service, emergency response, historical and cultural impacts that could add to the benefits and improve the business case for compliance with the guide. We only examined residential construction, so it would be worthwhile to understand the impacts on non-residential buildings. And finally, we focused on southern communities where we did examine Indigenous communities. We lacked the kind of real estate data that we had for the non-Indigenous communities, and we didn't examine northern and isolated communities at all. So that would be worthwhile to examine in some more depth. Okay, so for more information, you will find this deck at this URL. You'll find a short video, a long video, and again, the 5-page overview report and the 136-page scholarly report at these URLs. And with that, I'll conclude.
All right, well, thank you very much, Dr. Porter, and good on you for sticking to the 2 o'clock presentation deadline. So we have about a half an hour here for a question and answer period. We got a couple questions in the Q&A chat box already, but again, if any of the participants have any questions pop in their mind just as I'm talking or as they're being answered, just drop them right into the Q&A session and we'll do our best to answer them for you. So let's get started. We have a question first for Dr. Bénichou. So is this guideline applicable to a community level or an individual building?
So it could be both. So if community obviously is a number of buildings and resident within the, so definitely community level is well represented in this, because you can design the community, you can plan for the WUI area. But if, let's say, an owner would like to evaluate their own house or structure, they definitely, there is a way of using this, the guidance here. They can evaluate their priority areas. They can see whether their neighbors can accommodate that area. So, and then they can evaluate what kind of material they should be using based on whether the proper priority area is managed or not. So yeah, so it could be both ways, but it was meant for more on the community level than the individual structure. But yeah, provision can be accommodated as well for structures.
All right, and another question from Dr. Bénichou, again on the question of communities. Does the WUI guide take into account density of housing and the threat of house-to-house fire spread for the community planning recommendations?
Okay, so that was a big discussion actually during the development. Since the house-to-house spread of fire is more a building code evaluation. So building code has already distances from going from a house on fire to another one. That is dictated by the National Building Code. One of the things that we decided at the beginning of the development is whenever a code has addressed already something, then we didn't want to come and contradict that. So that was a very important decision to make. So for us is to look at the whole community or the structures and see at what time they ignite. And that is basically what we're trying to do. Once a structure ignites, if the other structures are very close, and then the building code, even with the building code, they may ignite after that. But for us is to minimize ignition from the beginning, so that the community can be cannot be impacted by wildfire. And if something is ignited, then you can manage at least the priority zone. But in terms of spread from one house to another one, this is more a code-related issue, and we didn't want to touch that.
All right, thank you. This next question here, I believe, is for Dr. Bénichou. I'm trying to determine which question is for whom based on the timing, which it's kind of in between you two. But it's, are you testing your guide against the current wildfires in BC?
Not yet, not yet. So that would be a good thing to do. So after we finish the guide, was just published at the end of June, or publicly available at the end of June. We wanted to actually do an implementation phase where we can take case studies and evaluate these case studies against the guide. So at this moment, this is something that we're planning, but we haven't really done any actual cases that are either happening right now or happened before. So, but that's something that we definitely want to do in the near future.
All right, thank you. And I have a question here for Dr. Porter. When incorporating climate change modeling into the cost-benefit analysis, what warming scenarios did you consider for this?
I believe we were looking at RCP 8.5. Honestly, I can't remember whether it was whether it was the moderate or the high representative concentration pathway. But we were only considering estimates of the increased ignitions due to lightning strikes. So our estimates of the effect of climate change were sort of on the high side for the representative concentration pathway, but sort of on the low side in light of, we were only considering increase in ignitions from lightning strikes, and we didn't make any assumptions about an increase in the ultimate size of the fire once a lightning strike ignited a fire.
All right, thank you. And I have another question here. It was asked during Dr. Porter's, so I assume it's directed to him. But I suppose either of you can answer this one. Should the NRC guide supersede or replace previous or similar publications from FireSmart?
Well, I'm gonna defer to Dr. Bénichou.
Yeah. Okay. So that's difficult to answer because we're trying to work actually with getting some information that is aligned with FireSmart. So the scope of the guide is a little bit larger than the FireSmart, but I think there are very important sections in FireSmart that should be taken into consideration, especially from the education side of the guidance. So we have, when we were developing this, FireSmart was involved in here. So we're trying to not contradict what exists out there, but more do a complementary work as much as possible. So I'm not sure about how we go about that, but I think the effort they have to be complementary as much as possible.
Okay, thank you for that. Another question here for Dr. Porter. Will insurers and reinsurers adjust pricing to reflect improved risk if communities spend time and money to mitigate the WUI fire risk?
Well, I think they can. I think Factory Mutual shows us that insurance companies can account for engineering attributes of buildings. They can it may take some time to catch up on the, sort of the actuarial basis, but it would take some effort. Insurance companies and reinsurers would have to take the trouble to compile the actuarial data to see how their risk is reduced. But of course, if there is an opportunity to get a market advantage through cherry picking, through identifying the properties or the communities that have lower risk and targeting them with lower prices, insurance companies generally do that eventually. So the possibility is there. I wouldn't expect it to take place immediately, and I wouldn't expect an insurance company simply to take our word for it that this is the degree of lower risk. However, I think that ultimately some insurers and reinsurers would catch on to the business opportunity of targeting lower risk communities and offering them incentives offering the consumer incentives to sign up, to save because they had protected their homes and their communities.
Thank you very much. And a nice simple question here to Dr. Bénichou. How is the hazard level developed?
So hazard level is based on the map that I showed. So that basically NRCan has a lot of work that they have been doing over the many years, and they use some of the models that they have developed in-house, and then they evaluate the hazard based on different things: fuel, slopes, temperatures, and so there are a number of factors. I think this is more on their side, because we want them to be involved in this so that we can use that expertise, and that's how they develop the map, and the map can be updated, obviously, because climate can change, and then regions that were not impacted before can be impacted. So this should be a dynamic map that should be updated on a regular basis, but mostly done through modeling at NRCan.
Okay, thank you very much. Another question here. It just popped up during the Q&A period, so I'm not quite sure who's directed to. So which one of you feels more appropriate, take it away. What would be a practical retrofit that homeowners can do to retrofit their elevated or non-elevated wood decks without also having to purchase additional standards or replacing the non-combustible materials?
So yeah, go ahead, Keith.
No, please. I was going to defer to you anyway.
Yeah, no, I think, yeah, so retrofitting is by looking at the measures that are inside the guide and see, so is the structure and the deck is close to the house. How is the basically the zone, how are the zone managed? So if there is a management of zone, then I think there is a little bit of leeway, or at least flexibility in terms of what kind of decking you would need. if the zones are not managed, then I think what was clear sometimes, if the decks are attached to structures and there is no management whatsoever, then you have to protect them in a way so that the structure cannot be vulnerable to any fire or amber that are going to be accumulating. So I would say that look at what the measures are inside and see how you manage the priority zone, and then after that, I think decide what are the best option, and then we have options for the different zone, how they are managed and so on. So.
Okay, and on a similar note, again to Dr. Bénichou, does the guide make any assumptions about which form of fire transmission, that is embers, radiant heat, or direct fire, is most dangerous?
Yeah, what we have seen, and I think this is historic, that based on what exists out there. So if you are very close, obviously the flames are going to be impacting directly but what we have seen, if you manage the priority zone, and sometimes I think that's what people try to do to get away a little bit from the flame or the direct radiation. I think embers can be a very high potential for ignition because they tend to fly or get lofted at a distance. I think 500 meters can be easy for the embers to travel and to land on the structure, or at least beside the structure. And if there is combustible close by, I think they can impact. So I would say, I think based on what I have read, maybe 50% of the cases, embers are going to be definitely very, very difficult. The way we understand them is still, there's still work to be done, but those embers are definitely something that has to be, we have to take note of that. So.
All right, thank you. I got an open question here to either of you. The guidance recommends requirements above the building code. However, some provinces have implemented building acts preventing local communities from having construction requirements that go above the provincial building code. Is there a recommended approach for communities to adopt or reference the code into a bylaw, similar to an ICLR code?
Yeah, I think that's a potential. That's a potential, definitely. So when we developed again the guide, the idea was first of all not to contradict the national building code, but definitely I think when there is no provision in the code, then I think the committee and NRC developed measures that can protect the structure. So a local community can adopt this as a bylaw, and then it can go and adopted or implemented beyond what the code requires.
Okay, I got another question here regarding the building-to-building fire response from earlier. Existing communities would have been built to the building code that existed at the time they were built, and may be different from the current code. Wouldn't retrofitting homes and buildings in these communities to be more resistant to building fire spread be beneficial and therefore be considered as a mitigation strategy?
Oh, no question about that. I think that's definitely so. So again, when we started developing, we didn't want to touch obviously what is existing in the code, but yeah, communities or owners can retrofit or I think the building such that you can minimize that spread. But this is going to be beyond what required by the national building code, but I understand it. I think if you have a code that was, let's say, published in 2005 and you have a 2020, anything that was built for 2005 cannot be adopted or adopt the 2020 code. But having said that, I think any community or any authority can try to see whether there is a high risk, and then if retrofitting of these houses can mitigate some of this, I think definitely would be very beneficial for it. So.
Okay, thank you very much. And another open question here. Does the guide recommend an increase in the amount of controlled burning and or allowing fires that are not close to structures to burn to reduce fuel buildup?
Okay, so that's what I think Keith had mentioned that, and he can. So this is basically nature-based measures that Keith talked a little bit about. this is definitely something that we want to include eventually. But yeah, burning and creating probably distances that are going to not allow the fire to spread that easily will be a good way to go. Keith, did you want to add anything there?
Oh, I would just reiterate that you know, that the National Research Council could collaborate with Indigenous experts to develop a detailed implementation guide that builds off of you know, the expertise that they've already shown. What we saw from our sampling is that when you have an Indigenous community right next door to a non-Indigenous community, the Indigenous community generally has like a 1 level lower exposure level thanks to fire stewardship. So I think that, you know, Canada has a lot to learn from the Indigenous communities to lower its to manage its vegetation, to reduce its WUI fire risk.
All right, well, thank you very much for answering all those questions, because we are out of questions now, and that pretty much concludes our presentation. I'll give you each a brief moment here to throw in any final comments you might want to add. First, Dr. Bénichou, and then Dr. Porter, and then I'll move to conclude. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I think final comment is just thank you very much for listening to our presentations. Hopefully, this is just a starting point, because wildfires are devastating communities. We have seen it just recently in the wildfires are burning out west. Lytton was destroyed, I think, at 90%. I believe that we have to put an effort to try to see how we can build some kind of resilience to these fires that are happening now more frequent, and then they are more intense, and they're everywhere around the world, by the way. So I think this is a starting point where we can build on it. We can move this to more regulation, I would say, eventually, so that it can be adopted eventually. But I think this problem is not going to be over soon, and I think we have to be prepared for it. There was also one I think Christine mentioned whether there were women involved. Yes, a lot of them, I think. So we have women participating in this effort, be it at the technical committee level, be it from NRC, or be it from the task group. I think there are many of them representing different organizations, and we're very proud of having them involved and contributing to this effort.
And I'll conclude by saying, you know, the wildfire risk is large, it's growing, it's not going away. It's just going to get worse. The sooner that we confront the problem, recognize it as a growing catastrophic risk, the less costly it's going to be to manage it. And what we've seen from this impact analysis and from similar analyses is that there's a really good business case for adopting the National WUI Guide. It makes great financial sense. It makes great policy sense. So I would simply close with the assertion that there really isn't any controversy about whether adopting a guide like this is a good idea or not, whether it's necessary or not, whether the WUI fire risk is going away. It isn't. The guide makes sense. The guide is excellent policy.
All right. Well, a big thanks to both Dr. Bénichou and Dr. Porter for taking time out of their busy schedules to provide us that informative and interesting presentation. I would also like to thank you in the audience for joining us today and providing those insightful questions. If you're interested in a recording of this session, it will be available on our website and YouTube channel shortly. And once more before we go, I'd like to take the opportunity to once again remind you that next month's Friday Forum will be on September 21st and cover the subject of coastal flooding. Thank you all for attending, and have a good day.
Have a good day, everyone. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.